Around 360 BCE, Plato described an island empire beyond the Pillars of Heracles and said that earthquakes and floods erased it in a single catastrophic day and night. The island was Atlantis. It was wealthy, militarily powerful, arranged around rings of land and water, and older than any civilization known to archaeology. That last detail is what makes the story extraordinary. Plato's characters place the war between Atlantis and ancient Athens 9,000 years before the time of the statesman Solon. Taken literally, that would move Atlantis deep into the end of the last ice age, thousands of years before the first cities, states, navies, metal industries, or written archives presently known from the archaeological record. For more than 2,000 years, almost every proposed solution has begun by adjusting something. The date becomes a copying error. The size becomes symbolic. The Pillars of Heracles move from Gibraltar to another strait. The island becomes a peninsula, a coast, a volcanic caldera, a desert formation, or an entire drowned continent. But a serious investigation has to begin before those adjustments. It must ask what the original source actually says, whether any source independent of Plato confirms it, and what physical evidence a civilization of this scale should have left. There are real drowned landscapes beneath modern seas. There are real cities destroyed by earthquakes, eruptions, and tsunamis. There are even places whose geography resembles one or two details in Plato's description. The unanswered question is whether these fragments add up to Atlantis, or whether the search has been trying to turn a philosophical story into a location. This documentary will test the strongest candidates, the strongest skeptical explanation, and the one fact that every Atlantis theory must confront. The city appears in history fully formed, inside the work of a single author. What Plato actually wrote. Atlantis enters the record in two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. The speaker Critias says that the Athenian lawgiver Solon heard the story from Egyptian priests at Sais. Solon supposedly passed it through his family until it reached the Critias speaking in Plato's dialogue. The Egyptian priest describes a prehistoric Athens with an ideal constitution. This ancient Athens defeats an aggressive maritime empire based on a vast island outside the Pillars of Heracles, usually understood as the Strait of Gibraltar. Atlantis rules other islands and territory reaching toward Egypt and Italy. After Athens defeats it, violent earthquakes and floods strike. The Athenian warriors sink into the earth, and Atlantis disappears into the sea. Critias then expands the picture. Poseidon creates alternating rings of land and water around a central hill. 10 royal lines govern the island. Canals connect the capital to the sea. A large rectangular plain supports agriculture and military power. The city contains walls coated with metals, temples, docks, ships, bridges, baths, and an enormous workforce. These details are often treated like coordinates in a treasure hunt. Yet their function inside the dialogue matters. Atlantis is not introduced in isolation. Socrates has just described an ideal state and asks to see a city like it tested in war. Critias offers ancient Athens as that ideal state made visible. Atlantis becomes its opposite, rich, imperial, technologically impressive, and eventually corrupted by appetite and power. 2. The surviving Critias ends at precisely that moral turning point. The Atlanteans have lost the divine quality that once restrained them. They appear magnificent from the outside but have become greedy and unjust. Zeus gathers the gods to punish them. Then the text breaks off before his speech. That unfinished ending changes the emphasis. Plato gives us pages of geography, architecture, political organization, and ritual, but the narrative is moving toward judgment. Atlantis is designed not simply as a place that vanished, but as a state that deserved correction. This does not prove that every detail was invented. Ancient authors could combine real geography, inherited stories, and philosophical purpose. But it means the correct starting assumption is literary. Before Atlantis can be treated as archaeology, it must be shown to exist outside the literary machine Plato built for it. The missing history before Plato. The first major problem is not underwater. It is documentary. No surviving Egyptian inscription, temple record, papyrus, or king list describes an empire matching Atlantis. No known Greek author before Plato tells the same story. Herodotus wrote extensively about Egypt, North Africa, the Western Mediterranean, unusual peoples, ancient traditions, and conversations with priests. He does not report Atlantis. Earlier poets and logographers knew Atlas, the Atlantic, distant islands, and flood traditions, but not Plato's island empire. Absence is not proof that something never existed. Ancient texts disappear constantly. Most papyri have not survived. Oral traditions can outlive the records that first contained them. But the absence becomes more significant when the missing civilization is said to have conquered territories from the Atlantic. Approaches to Egypt and Italy. Empires of that scale produce traces beyond their capitals, imported pottery, weapons, harbor installations, tribute systems, inscriptions, administrative objects, genetic movement, and echoes in the records of neighboring societies. Atlantis has none of that securely attached to its name or description. The chain of transmission is also difficult to test. Plato asks the audience to accept a story told by an Egyptian priest to Solon, remembered through several generations, and presented centuries later by a dramatic character. We possess no poem by Solon about Atlantis and no independent ancient copy of the alleged Egyptian record. Some later ancient writers debated whether Plato's story was factual, symbolic, or some combination of the two. But their discussions come after Plato. They show that people argued about Atlantis. They do not provide a source older than the dialogues. This is where many modern searches reverse the burden of proof. A circular formation, a submerged ruin, or a tsunami deposit is found, and then Plato's text is adjusted until the site fits. Historical method works the other way. A candidate must explain not one attractive resemblance but the full pattern, date, location, culture, scale, destruction, and evidence of contact with the societies Atlantis allegedly fought. Once that standard is applied, the mystery becomes clearer. We are not choosing among several confirmed Atlantean sites. We are asking whether any proposed site crosses the line from possible inspiration to historical identification. The date that refuses to fit. Of all Plato's details, the date is the hardest to absorb. The Egyptian priest tells Solon that ancient Athens was founded 9,000 years earlier and that the war with Atlantis belonged to that remote age. Solon lived around the 6th century BCE, placing the conflict roughly in the 10th millennium BCE. At that time, humans were not culturally simple, and the old stereotype of aimless cave dwellers is false. Communities hunted, fished, gathered plants, exchanged materials over distance, made art, built substantial structures in some regions, and adapted intelligently to rapid climatic change. Sites such as Göbekli Tepe, slightly later than Plato's proposed date, demonstrate complex ritual construction before farming cities. But complexity is not the same as Plato's Atlantis. The dialogue describes a state with kings, written laws, mines, metalworking on a monumental scale, chariot forces, docks crowded with ships, canals cut across. A huge plain, and an empire fighting from the Atlantic to the eastern Mediterranean. No comparable archaeological horizon exists in the 10th millennium BCE. This mismatch has produced two common repairs. The first says the Egyptian number was mistranslated and should be 900 years rather than 9,000. That would place the story in the Late Bronze Age, much closer to the worlds of Thera, Crete, Mycenae, and the upheavals around 1200 BCE. It is an elegant solution, but no surviving manuscript provides the smaller number. It is a modern correction made because the larger date is archaeologically difficult. The second treats the date as symbolic. Plato often used numbers structurally, and Egyptian antiquity carried enormous authority for Greek audiences. 9,000 years makes the story older than familiar history and gives the ideal Athens an almost cosmic prestige. If the number is literary, however, it cannot be used selectively as proof that Plato recorded an Ice Age civilization. The date therefore creates a dilemma. Reading it literally makes the described technology archaeologically unsupported. Changing it improves several candidate theories but weakens the claim that Plato transmitted an exact historical record. A strong theory must explain this problem openly rather than hiding it in a footnote. Santorini, the catastrophe that looks closest. The most famous candidate is Santorini, known in antiquity as Thera. In the 2nd millennium BCE, the island supported a prosperous Bronze Age community connected to the wider Aegean trading world. At Akrotiri, archaeologists uncovered multi-story buildings, paved streets, storage rooms, workshops, drainage systems, imported objects, and vivid wall paintings. The settlement was buried beneath volcanic material and preserved with extraordinary clarity. The eruption that transformed Thera was one of the largest volcanic events of the ancient Mediterranean. Its exact calendar year remains debated, but scientific dating places it in the 17th or 16th century BCE. The eruption reshaped the island, spread ash across a wide region, and generated tsunamis that struck other Aegean coasts. The parallels are powerful. Plato describes a wealthy maritime society. Akrotiri belonged to a sophisticated seafaring culture. Plato describes destruction involving earthquakes and floods. Thera experienced earthquakes, eruption, collapse, and tsunami. Plato describes a landscape organized around water, and modern Santorini is a dramatic ring surrounding a flooded caldera. This is why the Thera theory has endured. It offers something many candidates lack, a genuine civilization and a genuine catastrophe in the same place. But identification requires more than atmosphere. 4. Thera lies inside the Aegean, not beyond Gibraltar. The eruption occurred roughly 1,000 years before Plato, not 9,000 years before Solon. The preserved settlement at Akrotiri is impressive. But it was not the capital of a continent-sized empire. The circular caldera visible today is largely a volcanic landform, not the engineered sequence of concentric canals described around Atlantis's royal center. Most importantly, the Minoan world did not disappear in one day. The eruption damaged regional networks, but palatial civilization on Crete continued for generations. Its eventual political collapse had a longer and more complicated history. Santorini therefore works best as possible source material rather than a solved location. A story about a rich island culture, a maritime world, and a spectacular destruction could have traveled and changed. Plato could also have known broader Greek traditions about volcanic islands and drowned coasts without preserving a precise memory of Thera. That is an important distinction. A historical disaster can help an author imagine Atlantis without being Atlantis. After this first factual payoff, consider subscribing if you value documentaries that preserve the mystery while testing the evidence. The next candidate is less visually similar than Santorini, but it may be closer to Plato in time and in the exact mechanism of destruction. Helike, the city that really disappeared. In the winter of 373 BCE, the Greek city of Helike on the Gulf of Corinth was destroyed by an earthquake and tsunami. Ancient accounts made its fate famous. The city was associated with Poseidon, and later, observers reported submerged ruins in the area. Modern investigation has identified destruction layers, classical building remains, tsunami evidence, and lagunal sediments on the Helike plain. The date is striking. Helike vanished only about a decade before the period in which Timaeus and Critias are generally placed. Plato lived in a Greek world where the destruction of a prosperous city by earthquake and water was not prehistoric speculation. It had happened within living memory. Helike also supplies a detail that makes the comparison difficult to ignore: Poseidon. In Plato, Poseidon founds Atlantis, shapes its rings, fathers its royal dynasty, and receives worship at the center of the capital. Helike was an important center of Poseidon worship before natural disaster overwhelmed it. Yet Helike is not Atlantis. It was a Greek city on the northern Peloponnese, not an island beyond the Pillars of Heracles. Its scale was regional, not continental. It did not command the empire Plato describes, and its archaeological remains belong to the classical period rather than the end of the Ice Age. Its real value is explanatory. Helike shows that Plato did not need access to a 9,000-year-old secret archive to imagine a city punished through earthquake and inundation. The physical image was present in his own century. This points toward a composite model. Plato may have combined the memory of recent Helike traditions, of earlier Aegean disasters, familiar political conflicts, and invented geography. Authors do this without leaving a neat boundary between borrowed element and created structure. A composite Atlantis would explain why so many candidates resemble the story in one way and fail in 5 others. Santorini offers the volcanic island and maritime culture. Helike offers the sudden destruction and Poseidon connection. Athens' own imperial history offers the political warning. The Western Ocean offers distance, scale, and mystery. The result would not be a coded map. It would be an engineered story built from recognizable materials. 5. Spain, Tartessos, and the marshes. Another major search area lies in southwestern Spain, near the Atlantic coast beyond Gibraltar. This region attracts attention because it respects one of Plato's clearest geographic statements. It was also home to Tartessos, a real and wealthy culture known through archaeology and ancient references during the early 1st millennium BCE. The lower Guadalquivir region contains broad marshes, shifting shorelines, buried channels, tsunami deposits, and landscapes that have changed dramatically since antiquity. Satellite images and geophysical surveys have sometimes revealed circular or rectangular features beneath the Dinana wetlands. These have been promoted in documentaries as possible remains of an Atlantis-like city destroyed by a giant wave. The setting is compelling. It lies near the gateway between the Mediterranean and Atlantic. Tsunamis have affected the Iberian coast. Tartessos was associated with metals, trade, and Western wealth. A drowned or buried settlement in this region would be archaeologically important even if it had no connection to Plato. But the public claim has repeatedly moved faster than the evidence. Geometric shapes in remote Sensing data can represent natural channels, agricultural modifications, later structures, or processing. Artifacts. A feature is not a city until excavation establishes walls, occupation layers, datable objects, and a coherent plan. The chronology also remains a problem. Tartessian culture belongs mainly to the first millennium BCE. That is much closer to Plato than to the 9,000-year date in his story. Reducing Plato's years by a factor of 10 is sometimes proposed, but there is no manuscript evidence that the number was accidentally multiplied in this way. Nor has the region produced an archaeological complex matching Atlantis's immense capital, engineered rings, naval installations, and imperial reach. What exists is a genuine historical culture placed inside a dramatic and unstable coastal environment. The Spanish theory demonstrates a recurring pattern. When a candidate matches the location, it misses the date and the described city. When a candidate matches the catastrophe, it misses the location. When it matches the rings, it lacks archaeology. A valid identification would need these lines to converge rather than take turns. The Eye of the Sahara. The Rikhat structure in Mauritania is one of the most visually arresting Atlantis candidates. From orbit, it appears as a vast bullseye of concentric rings nearly 50 kilometers across. It sits in northwestern Africa, within a broader region that ancient Mediterranean peoples knew imperfectly. Supporters compare its rings, surrounding high ground, nearby salt deposits, and ancient waterways to selected passages in Critias. The resemblance is immediate on a satellite image. It is also largely superficial. NASA describes the Rikhat structure as a circular anticline, a symmetrical geological uplift exposed by erosion. Resistant rock layers form the visible rings. The structure developed through geological processes over immense time, not through human engineering. Its scale is much larger than Plato's central island and canal system when the measurements are read conventionally. The site is also far inland today. Proposals that an Atlantic inlet reached it during the period of human civilization require major geographical changes for which the regional geology has not produced. 6. Convincing evidence. Ancient lakes and river systems certainly existed across a greener Sahara, but a navigable ocean surrounding the Rikhat structure is a different claim. Human beings occupied the Sahara in prehistoric periods, and stone tools occur in the wider region. That establishes human presence, not an urban empire. No confirmed remains of monumental walls, harbors, dense habitation, writing, metal industries, or the infrastructure expected from Plato's capital have been documented at the rings. The Rikhat theory is useful because it reveals the power of shape. Once viewers see concentric circles, every other detail can begin to feel like supporting evidence. But archaeology does not identify cities from resemblance alone. It identifies patterns of human activity preserved in materials and layers. The Rikhat structure is real, spectacular, and scientifically explainable. The city placed upon it exists only after the geological formation is viewed through Plato's description. Real drowned worlds, but not Atlantis. The strongest reason not to dismiss every flood tradition is that post-Ice Age coastlines changed on a scale difficult to imagine today. Between Britain and continental Europe, the southern North Sea once contained a broad inhabited landscape now called Doggerland. Fishing and research have recovered animal bones, antler tools, and other evidence from terrain that is now seabed. Rising seas gradually reduced this world as ice sheets melted. Around 6200 BCE, the Thera submarine landslide generated a major tsunami across parts of the North Atlantic. Doggerland proves that populated landscapes can vanish beneath the sea and survive only through scattered objects, sediments, and reconstruction. But it was not an urban naval empire. Current modeling also suggests that gradual sea level rise, rather than one tsunami alone, was the main force behind its long-term loss. Other submerged settlements tell similar stories. Pavlopetri in Greece preserve streets and buildings beneath shallow water. Ancient ports have sunk through earthquakes and land subsidence. Coastal cities have been buried by sediment or abandoned after harbors shifted. Archaeology is not unfamiliar with lost places. These discoveries make Atlantis emotionally plausible. Human communities have watched coastlines advance, islands fracture, and familiar ground disappear. Memories of such events can become stories. And stories can travel far beyond the landscapes that produced them. But real drowned worlds also show what evidence looks like. They leave tools, food remains, buildings, burials, pollen, ceramics, worked stone, datable sediments, and environmental sequences. Their destruction can be reconstructed because independent lines of evidence meet. Atlantis lacks that convergence. Instead, each new drowned site is often called an Atlantis, using the name as a metaphor for loss. Over time, the metaphor is mistaken for identification. The existence of submerged archaeology makes the search scientifically legitimate. It does not make every submerged discovery part of Plato's story. What a real Atlantis would have left. Suppose Atlantis was not entirely invented. What evidence should researchers expect? First, there should be a site with a defensible chronology. If Plato's 9,000 years are literal, the culture belongs near the end of the last ice age. A city with large-scale canals, metal architecture. 7. Organized armies, ships, writing, and state administration at that date would transform world archaeology. Its material culture should be unmistakable. If the date is not literal, the theory must explain why it is wrong without changing numbers only to rescue a preferred location. Second, there should be evidence of settlement. Concentric geology is not enough. Researchers would need foundations, construction debris, occupation surfaces, refuse, tools, ceramics, burials, workshops, or harbor works. A capital supporting a large population would create a thick archaeological signature. Third, an empire leaves external traces. Plato's Atlantis attacks territories across the Mediterranean world. Its goods, weapons, symbols, or political effects should appear beyond the island. Even defeated powers survive in the records and material culture of their neighbors. Fourth, geology must support the proposed destruction. Continents do not sink into the deep Atlantic in a day. Ocean floor mapping and plate tectonics show the structure and age of Atlantic crust. Real lands can subside, coastlines can flood, volcanoes can collapse, and islands can erode. But each mechanism has limits that can be measured. Finally, the identification should explain the whole text better than the literary explanation does. Plato's ideal Athens, Atlantean corruption, divine punishment, and political contrast are not decorative details. They are the narrative's purpose. No proposed site currently satisfies all these tests. This conclusion is not closed-minded. It is provisional and falsifiable. A discovery with architecture, datable artifacts, inscriptions, and the correct environmental history would force reassessment. That is the difference between skepticism and dismissal. Skepticism states what evidence would change. The answer: what the evidence can and cannot prove. Several conclusions are strong. Plato is the earliest surviving source for the Atlantis story. His account is embedded in a philosophical drama about political order, imperial ambition, moral decline, and punishment. No independent Egyptian archive or pre-Platonic account confirming Atlantis has been found. No archaeological site has been demonstrated to match the civilization as a whole. Santorini offers the strongest combination of real island culture and catastrophic natural event, but its location, date, scale, and historical aftermath do not match Plato literally. Helike offers a near contemporary model of a city destroyed by earthquake and tsunami, with a connection to Poseidon, but it is not Atlantis. Southwestern Spain offers a plausible Western setting and real cultures, yet no excavated Atlantean capital. The Rickhat structure offers dramatic rings, but geology explains them and archaeology has not revealed the required city. Doggerland and other submerged landscapes prove that real worlds have been lost, while also demonstrating the kinds of evidence Atlantis does not possess. The most realistic interpretation is that Atlantis was Plato's creation, perhaps assembled from real disasters, geographic knowledge, inherited flood stories, and the political history of the Greek world. That position does not require Plato to have invented every image from nothing. It requires only that the final island empire, with its exact role in the dialogues, belonged to his design. What remains uncertain is the source of individual elements. Did stories of the Thera eruption survive long enough to influence later Greeks? Did the destruction of Helike supply the immediate physical model? Did Western trade, Tartessian wealth, or reports of Atlantic geography contribute details? The evidence cannot currently assign percentages to Plato's imagination and his borrowed material. 8. Atlantis may therefore be real in a more complicated sense. It preserves real human fears, that prosperity can become arrogance, that political power can outrun moral restraint, and that even the strongest societies are vulnerable to sudden environmental change. Those truths do not require a sunken continent. The opening question was whether any real evidence supports the lost city. There is real evidence for the disasters, cultures, and drowned landscapes that make the story believable. There is no real evidence that identifies Plato's Atlantis as a historical place. The most useful mystery is no longer where Atlantis is hidden. It is why a philosophical warning has been repeatedly treated as a damaged map. So the final question is specific: if archaeologists never find Plato's ringed capital, which real event, Thera, Helike, a western coastal disaster, or a combination of several, best explains the images that made Atlantis endure?